What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast that interviews creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name is Phillip Russell, and I am with my co-host,
Ben Thorp.
And Ben, we have a tremendous guest this week, somebody we've been wanting to have for so long, and we've been big fans of for so long. This week we're talking to Austin Walker. We cover everything from, the state of games, media, and journalism writ large to, Austin's own career transitioning from games journalism and criticism to games development. And just like what makes good criticism. This was a really kind of all-encompassing conversation. So I think we just want to let it speak for itself, and we can come in after the conversation to kind of dive into some key points. But yeah, I think we just wanted to note that we did record this conversation with Austin on April 17th, I believe. So probably about a week or so before it was announced that Waypoint would be shutting down. So we don't get into that on the show. But just know that we are as upset as everybody else is. Waypoint's done incredible work, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in the post-show.
Yeah, and I think it's also super worth noting that we did ask about it. I mean, I think we asked about like the state of games journalism, because that's something that for both of us is top of mind. I'm sure people have noticed we ask now every guest, like, hey, how are things going? If you touched games media in any way, how sad are you on a general basis? So yeah, we definitely got into it with Austin there. But I think, again, yeah, as Phil's saying, worth caveating, this happened before the Waypoint got hit.
Yeah. So with that, how about we just hop right into the conversation? Austin Walker is the IP director at the game studio Possibility Space. He has an extensive background in gaming journalism and criticism, and he holds a Master's of Aesthetics and Politics from CalArts. He served as the editor-in-chief of Vice's Waypoint and the host of Waypoint Radio. And in addition to all those exciting things, he also hosts the podcast called Friends of the Table, which is a tabletop role-playing podcast, and co-hosts a Star Wars podcast called A More Civilized Age. Austin, thanks so much for coming on the show. We're really excited to have you.
When's this going out? When's this live? Because depending on when it is, there may be another podcast I'm co-hosting by the time this.
Oh shit! Well, when's that project?
It won't. I don't think it'll drop until June, so I think this is probably a little too early. But I'm very excited about having a fourth podcast or third now podcast that I'm in the I'll be in the third chair of that one. It's a different experience because I'm not hosting or producing it. AMCA, A More Civilized Age, the Star Wars podcast I'm on, I produce and co-host, and then Friends at the Table, I'm like the showrunner, so to speak, if a tabletop role-playing game podcast can have a showrunner. And those are much different, responsibility levels than show up and talk about a thing, But thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. We are huge fans of yours. We've been listening to Waypoint, since its inception. So if anything, it's great to finally have you on the show, especially after just having Natalie on to kind of talk about her journey.
What a year she's having. I could not be more proud of her. She is someone who has always impressed me ever since she was an intern at Waypoint. And seeing the heights she's already reached, Immortality was such a success, and the work that she has done, throughout the rest of the elements of her career have been incredible. So truly proud to be friends with Natalie Watson.
100%. Yeah, and you and her both kind of have an interesting shared trajectory in that, going from criticism, games journalism into game development now. in addition to all the other projects that you both have like a number of other things going on. So I'm just curious, like, how you doing in general, how you juggling all these things, how's it going?
Bro, I'm getting through. It's tough, right? I will say still living in the aftershock of and the ongoing life of being in a global pandemic, going through the era of like deep quarantine was really, really hard as a creator, as a storyteller, as a writer, as a critic. If you go back to some of the earliest shit I was writing, I can curse on here, right? That's okay. If I can go back to some of the earliest stuff I was writing in the broader, critical sphere, one of the things I hit as often as I could was like, I was writing about video games a lot, but the thing I said over and over again was like, you have to care about more than video games if you're going to be a good video game critic. In the same way that if you're going to be a good film critic, you have to understand something about architecture, about painting, about culture and politics and history and all that stuff, and like have a broad base to pull stuff from, and that will lift your work so much because you won't be stuck referencing copies of copies of copies. Do you know what I mean? It's like one of those things where it's like, if all you care about is video games, then you're going to find yourself making references, especially in video games, where you're like, oh, I remember that from Halo. And like, nah. You remember that from Alien. You know what I mean? And like, Halo took that from somewhere. And to be clear, Alien is also playing in a certain mold, right? Like, having that space to play with, and having those other touchstones helps ground your criticism and your responses to things, and helps you elucidate things for your readership. Living in a global pandemic meant cutting a lot of that down. Obviously, you could still like stream movies, but I missed being in the world so badly. I was paying New York rent to like not get to go to the museum. You know what I mean? Like to not get to go to the park, to like not go people watch. And that was really tough. Also, I'm trash at working from my desk, especially at the time I was living in a different apartment, and I was like in a tiny bedroom the bedroom size was fine, but when it's your bedroom and it's your office space and you're like 2 steps between your bed and your desk, it's like I can't do the same sort of work here. Like I can do it, but I literally could only write at that desk, like do real writing work after like 2 a.m. when everybody else was asleep in the world. And then I could like, in the English-speaking American world, and then I could get work done. You have no idea how many Waypoint era reviews I wrote late at night at like 2 or 3 a.m. because no one else was awake. Or I would go to a cafe and write in the middle of the day because I could do that there, but I couldn't do it at my own desk. And so suddenly not having that option to go write somewhere else, or to go be somewhere else, to go ruminate somewhere else, other than like doing walks around my neighborhood, that was really hard. So I'm still coming out of that a little bit. I think every project I touched during that period shows I think that's probably true for most people who make stuff, is like, I don't care if you're making stuff about the global pandemic, you are making something touched by it. And so I'm finally getting back to a flow where I can feel like I'm doing the work and not figuring out how to do the work, if that makes sense. Like figuring out the processes, figuring out, at this point it's like, all right, like, I can go sit out at an outdoor cafe. I can go mask up and go somewhere else. I'm in a new apartment that I got specifically to help handle this problem. And I have to like get up and walk through my kitchen to my front little area. It's a studio, but it's like a long studio. So I have to like, I can't see my bed from here. And that's huge, So like that situation, I think in general, like figuring out those processes has put me in a better place than I was like a year ago,
I'm so glad you said all that stuff about criticism, because I think one of the questions that I have teed up is like how you think about criticism. And I think like what you're describing there, where you're weaving in all these other different things, whether it's architecture or whether it's philosophy or whether it's theory, has really stood out to me over the years in terms of like, that's what I get out, where it's like, I'll listen to you talk about a game and suddenly I feel like I'm learning about something completely else. And I would almost just,
which some people hate, by the way, because they're listening to games criticism because they're tired and want to know, like, is this a fun thing for me to do for the 2 hours I have of free time tonight? Like, I get that. But yeah, for me, it's like, I have to do it that way. I have to draw those connections out. I remember like writing about Far Cry 5 and being like, I can't write about Far Cry 5 until I understand what like contemporary theory around cults is. Like, why am I wasting my time writing about that game until I understand not what pop cultural understanding is around what cults are, but like some like firsthand accounts. Like, is brainwashing a thing? Like, is like what is the cult experience for real? What do people who have studied this, where are they at with that stuff? Because otherwise I'm going to be a rube and like repeat the company line on it, which is that they've done the research and they know what they're talking about. And they didn't in that case. Like, there's stuff about Far Cry 5 I think was enjoyable, but like a lot of that stuff was playing in a pop cultural space, which is a fine place to play. But like when that material is out there, and also, you know, you were talking about a game that came out, I don't remember the exact year, but like, you know, the Nexium shit was not that far off from there. Like, Cults is out there, and plus they were playing with Cults and they were playing with like, you know, right-wing malicious stuff, which, by the way, we talked about this a lot at the time, but like, that was some stuff they were saying behind closed doors, and then the second they had to be public with it, they quieted that part up real quick. They were not talking about, you know, the sort of like, you know, right-wing sovereign citizen movement stuff at all publicly, but in the behind closed doors demos, it was all over the place. And so very interesting maneuvers happening there. And so, yeah, for me, if you're going to be a critic, and I don't like drawing the line between reviewer and critic, because I think all sorts of writing about an object moves between those spaces, and I don't like drawing the hard line that says, like, consumer reviews have nothing, you know, critical to say, or they're not cultural or something, because you'll sometimes find really sharp cultural moments inside of a consumer review, even if it's not necessarily intentional. Someone will slip into a narrative about their life and like how the car that they bought or the car that they're reviewing fits into their life, or how the laptop that they're reviewing was very important to them during a moment of grief, or you know what I mean? Like, that stuff still slips in every now and then, and they don't necessarily mean to do it, but like, writing is writing, and sometimes it happens. And so I don't like drawing a firm thing, but obviously there is something like a strategic separation between the consumer reviewer and the cultural critic. It's a border that has lots. It's porous, right? But for me, as someone who wants to be on that other side to the degree that it really exists, you have to be drawing those other connections out there, because that's for two reasons. One is like, that's what's going to move the person reading, and two, that's what's fun about it for me, is being like, well, how does this connect to other stuff? This stuff doesn't exist in a vacuum. How does it make me think of a billion other things? You know, like, I don't know, like, I'm not a Roland Barthes like guy. Like, that's not my space inside of media criticism. But when my man was writing about pro wrestling, like, he was spitting. You know what I mean? Like, that was real stuff. He was making connections to culture. He was making connections to politics. And it was better because it was tied to wrestling. It was grounded. It was that sort of thing. And I think that there are times when, as a writer, you can get caught up in trying to say, you can get caught up in your criticism being a vehicle for a bigger thing you want to talk about, and you're like in search of the perfect vehicle to do that. And I think that can be a speed bump at best, and like a real derailment at worst. In general, if I always found that if I had that in me, if I was like, I really want to talk about blank topic, I couldn't tie that to like a new release. I had to go find that like set of 3 or 4 things to write about and put them in conversation together and then go write about them. It was rare that I could be like, I really want to talk about, you know, I really want, you know, I think about something like when The Crew came out. I could have tried to make a review for The Crew, which I reviewed for Paste Magazine. Shout outs to Paste Magazine. Shout outs to Garrett Martin. Like, truly games criticism, not what it has. The last decade of games criticism is on Garrett Martin's back for giving a lot of people opportunities early on, and then people moving on to write for other outlets. But I wrote about The Crew, and the thing I ended up writing about The Crew was I went into it thinking, ooh, can I write about the American car culture? Can I write about, and The Crew, for people who don't know, it was an Ubisoft open world racing game. Lots of like RPG elements, lots of like the numbers go up, you get a new car, you get new rims, you get new exhaust, you get new engine parts, blah, 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 blah. And I went into it being like, I bet I could write something about like, and I think some of it's still in there, like Postcard America, the vision of America from this French developer. How do you sell America back to them, etc. But the thing that actually mattered in my critique of that game was not about that stuff at all. And it was about like the move in video games towards that like numbers go up design and that feeling that you're getting better that has nothing to do with your skill actually improving, but has to do with like the game giving you better handling over a long period of time, giving you better acceleration, not necessarily teaching you how to race better, but like, because again, it's a racing game, but instead just kind of twisting the numbers until you naturally or you non-naturally just perform better. And that to me is the heart of the critique of that game. And I think it's informed by that bigger picture, but I couldn't force that bigger picture through and have that be the thesis necessarily without undercutting my criticism sometimes. So like, I do think that there's a limit to how well you can come into a piece with like a big idea and like see if it fits. You have to let the work guide you. But if it has to guide, but I want to be guided somewhere. I don't want to sit there and be like, and it feels pretty good to aim down the sights with the left trigger, you know?
Where does that, where for you did that maybe come from? I think like for Phil and I, at least, I feel like I was introduced to thinking about games in this way from Waypoint, but also, you know, through kind of going through grad school, that it kind of grad schoolifies your brain and you're like, well, wait, what's a way that we can think about this in more layered ways? How did you kind of come to thinking about things in this way?
Yeah, it's like I can tell like 6 different origin stories for this, right? Not to like name drop the pod, but
let's
like,
go.
The earliest, yeah, exactly. Y'all gotta get the like the hip hop like drop, you know what I mean? Origin story, you know, and then like boom, boom, you hit it like Funkmaster Flex.
Austin said the thing.
Yeah, exactly. At the earliest is like, you know, my mom is a poet, right? And like I grew up playing language games with her. And going to poetry readings with her and hating going to poetry readings with her. She makes fun of me now for like some of the times that in Friends at the Table I veer towards the poetic, right? Because as a little kid, I was like not a poetry person, right? That's just because like you're a little kid and you're being dragged to an event and you're like, I want to be at home playing Super Mario Brothers or Zelda or whatever, right? So that was a huge part of it, right? I was always playing language games with my mom. I was always talking about, you know, what I was seeing, and she was asking me questions about it, what I liked about a thing. What you know, oh, I really like this episode of X-Men. What did I really like about this episode of X-Men? Talk to me about what you think mutants stand for, etc., blah, blah, blah. And then the same thing with my dad. My parents are divorced, right? And so if I had to say, like, what's the thing that was, like, the defining, like, experience of like time spent with my dad. I lived with my mom and then my stepdad, and then I would visit my dad regularly, on and off, depending on what year of my childhood it was, how close he lived to me, blah, blah, blah. But for a big period of time there, the thing was going to the movies or going over to his place and watching a movie, like going to the rental store, getting a movie, bringing it home and watching it. For a good period of time there, and I think I've told this story before, but after we watched a movie, he busted out the yellow legal pads and he was like, all right, Oss, write your review. Write it. And, you know, this is like me at 10 trying to impersonate a film reviewer. You know what I mean? Like writing the, you know, the acting was so powerful. I thought that when Denzel said King Kong ain't got shit on me, you know what I mean? Like that style of just like, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was grasping at something and I was being asked to do it and being told effectively, you can do this. Anybody can watch a movie and then take 5 minutes to think about it, write down your thoughts, and then we'd share. He would also go do this. He'd write his review and I'd write my review, and then we'd compare notes, right? And so sometimes I really liked something and he didn't, or vice versa. And I'd be like, you know, I can see your point, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, again, I'm a kid, right? So I always had that as like an experience that like, again, you can tell that origin story and be like, that's the moment. And that's only like half the moment, right? Because then you have to talk about, you know, I have to talk about like being a nerdy kid in school who like found my self-identification through a really terrible sort of egoism about being smart, being the smart kid when I was in, you know, elementary school and junior high, and then going to high school and like getting the like life lesson of like, oh, you were a big fish in a small pond when you were in 7th grade and 8th grade. You were not that in 9th grade. You don't know how algebra works at all, my man. You got to slow down, right? And then still like struggling to identify myself through like being smart and being arty and being, you know, good at books and good at reading and like reading my reading comprehension scores and my AP test and like still like very unhealthily focused on that stuff, so that when I went into like I tell this story sometimes too, which is that like my first week of high school, someone asked me what my schedule was like. Someone new, someone I did not know, not from my previous school. And I was like, well, I'm in honors this and honors that. And he was like, bro, you have to stop saying that you're in honors English and honors bio. And for me, that was like I was putting a cloak on. Like that was my defensive maneuver, was to be like, no one knows me, but I'm in all honors classes, you know. And I was not in all honors classes for long. To be clear, like I got through like a year of that, and then was like, nah, I'm out. No more honors science, please. No more honors math. I cannot hang. As anyone who's listened to my podcast where a science topic shows up knows. So like I think part of the like critical like position or perspective is almost like a healed version of wanting to be the smartest person in the room at all times, and needing to like realize how many relationships I ruined by being that and trying to be the smartest or cleverest person in a room. And then slowly over the course of like a decade, and this is grad school stuff, right, is like, oh, I don't know shit. Like grad school is the ego killer if you're doing it for real, right? You sign up to be told you're wrong over and over again. You sign up to have your like positions challenged by people who are invested in their positions, and ideally by mentors and teachers who are invested in helping you sharpen yours, which almost always means asking yourself questions over a longer period of time than you normally get to, which is like, this is the thing that grad school is good for me, or like academia. The thing I miss about academia is having a question and then having a year to answer it instead of having a month before a publication date hits. Do you know what I mean? Like in academia, you take a big problem, and normally, you know, if you're trying to write like a paper, maybe you hit a point where you're like, and that's beyond the scope of this paper. But if you're doing like a book project, you're doing your dissertation research, you don't get to say, and that's beyond the scope, until pretty late in the process, till years into the process. You have to spend a lot of time being like, I wish this was beyond the scope of the project, but it isn't. I have to go back and do more research. I have to go ask more people questions. I have to go read some secondary materials that I left out. I have to go over my data and see if I missed something. All of that stuff that in media, for instance, you don't have that long turnaround time. You don't have that, I'm going to stay in the lab, like, again, to keep it like fighting games. The difference between media and academia is media has a real like pick up and play Call of Duty mode where you're like, all right, I'm just going to hop in and play some matches. I'm going to have a good time with it. I'm going to be competitive. I want to like go out there and really show off, but like I'm not pro. And then academia has like a fighting game atmosphere where like there is no casual academia mode. You have to go to the lab. You have to learn the footsies. You know what I mean? Like you have to learn your mix-ups. You have to. There's no I'm going to get the SMG and just like learn the map a little bit, which is what you can do a little bit in media. Media is a bigger space, and I don't know that it's a bad thing for media to be that. Like it's responsive, it's colloquial, all of those are positive things. But the thing I miss about being in academia a little bit is that big question of like, damn, what do I actually think is happening? For instance, is a topic that I never finished, right? And so it's going to be in my brain forever. In EVE Online, a game, for people who don't know, a game about spaceships and spreadsheets. It's like a big MMO, like something like Final Fantasy XIV or World of Warcraft, except so much of it, and I'm trying not to be reductive, is driven by two things. One is an intense amount of math and preparation, and the second is an intense amount of social play, that even people who are not role-playing are so invested in their character and in their social communities that they're doing really intensive, impassioned action. There's very little at the high level of play for EVE Online. There's very little like, I'm just going to do my dailies, which is what you might hear from someone who does another type of MMO, massively multiplayer online game, where they're like, I'm going to just hop in and I'll run like 2 or 3 little quests, or I'll do I'll run through a dungeon, they might say. That's just like not how EVE works for that top tier of player. And there's a lot, the cutoff on EVE is a lot higher. And so my question had always been like, where is the labor in EVE Online? Is it only in the developers, or are the people the product in something like EVE Online? Because that game falls apart the second the players don't take it seriously, right? You need a big player base to be committed to playing it in the way it's designed, and it's not a public park in that way, right? Like a public park, you show up and you play, and so then like your taxes go to keep the park, operating. It's like an amusement park where the other players are the rides, right? And like is that labor? Where's the line there? Is it not a line? Are those overlapping categories play in labor? And there's some really fun things that come up when you go into the study of this, where you're like, early on EVE Online, one of my favorite stories about it, and it's like, this is labor action to me. The way EVE Online worked is, and it still works like this to some degree, in a lot of like role-playing games, you get more powerful as you complete content. You beat monsters, you solve puzzles, you complete dungeons and quests and stuff like that, and so you level up. That is not how it works in EVE Online. You might get money and stuff from doing those things in the game. Not real money, though, EVE Online has some, kind of real money. But the way your character gets better at things is, it's a sci-fi game. It's a kind of a cyberpunk game in some ways. You put chips in your head and you download the data like the Matrix into your character's head. And that's just going all the time. It's always going. You have a queue of your next up set of like skills you're gonna learn, basically. So you're like, all right, I want to get better at turrets, so I'm gonna have the turret chip just downloading away. Even when I'm not playing the game, it's downloading. Now, when the game first launched, you could only queue up a handful of these at once, and they would take hours and hours and hours to go through your character. And so sometimes that meant one would end at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. And so players were waking up in the middle of the night, setting alarms for themselves so they could get up and put in that new skill chip so they could start downloading the next skill quicker than their rivals could, who are sleeping in, so that the next time they have a fight, you're at turret level 5 and they're only at turret level 4 because they stayed asleep. And so eventually, players put together a sort of informal council and went to the developer and were like, yo, you cannot make us wake up at 3 a.m. to get like a little bit of a percentage point of an improvement. And so they changed the way that skill queuing system works so you could queue more skills so that you wouldn't have to get up in the middle of the night to fix that, right? And to me, that's like this sort of small sort of labor action where like, okay, if the players are the product, which I think they are, then they're actually, what they're actually arguing for is not like a quality of life change for a video game player. It's like, hey, if you want me to continue being the product for you, I need to not have to wake up at 3 a.m. They're not asking for a raise, but they are asking for better hours in a weird way. And so like, to me, you only get to that if you I spent 6 months trying to figure out what the fuck is going on with EVE Online play and labor. And I need another 2 years to do it right. And now I would need another 3 years, because that 6 months that I spent 6 years ago, 7 years ago doesn't matter anymore. That's gone. You know what I mean? Who cares about what I knew about EVE Online a decade ago? That's old news. So like, you only get there from that long study. And so that's the thing that I do think, if academia has a place inside of criticism, it lets you do that sort of long form, sit with it thing that most critics in today's economy cannot justify doing without also having another, income stream somewhere, so.
Yeah.
Sorry for that very long, weird tangent on this, but
that makes, there's so much there. Just to back us up a little bit to some of your stories, like I think the first thing I appreciate with that story is just like the relationship that you had with both of your parents and how they kind of are giving you the paradigm of like why criticism is important. One, you have to experience art, you have to experience life and just take it in. And then like with your dad, like there's a lot of value and, discourse and talking about different ideas, different perspectives on the same thing. And that doesn't make it, I think especially in the games industry, well, not the industry, but in the gaming community, there's a lot of kind of toxicity around like criticism and how criticism is like being negative toward a game. And like, when the reality is like, being critical of something usually comes from a deep place of love and like interest, which I think, that story you're telling that with your dad, it's like a perfect example at like a really young age of, articulating that to a kid.
There's a parallel story with my dad that I don't actually tell that often, which is, my dad is someone who I think his career has been in retail and sales, right? Like he's been a salesman for most of his life. He ran some retail stores for a while, business owner for a little while. I mean, still technically is a business owner, but his primary income is through sales. But he's also a musician, right? And he asked me from a very young age, and still to this day, he will send me a song and be like, all right, Oz, what do you think? Like, write me your review of this like skeleton demo of this like track that I put together in Logic. Which, by the way, this is a strange story to say here, but like my dad recently learned how to use Logic to make music, and he'd been making music his whole life. Do you know what I mean? And so the secondhand joy I have from seeing him learn how like loops work and how like the deep well of instruments that you can pull from to work with has been so fun. But he would also ask me to bring that same response to his music, and he was never like, I have a new song, Austin, you know, like I'm going to play it for you, period. That's it. I'm going to play it at the end. He was like, tell me what you think. What do you think about the bridge? Like, and so in some ways that's a lot harder, right? And in some ways it also prepared me, I think, a little bit more for the grad school thing of like, you're going to get your stuff torn into, you know? And I don't care how good the prose is, which has like always been a struggle for me, where like, I can get the prose good, but if I'm not saying something good, it doesn't matter. Like you might trick some people because your word choice is pretty good, but if you don't have an argument, like, for me, the most important note I ever got on a paper back was I did a piece. It's not a piece. It's an essay for grad school. When I was doing my master's, an essay I wrote was about it was like a very basic like film studies class, right? And so I got assigned, or somehow I ended up writing about Seven Samurai. I was like, write about one scene in Seven Samurai, or it wasn't one scene, it was about a bunch of different stuff. The professor was like, this professor was like cool with me. Like I had done research work with this professor. He knew that I was like not half-assing it, but he gave me like a trash grade on this paper. And he said, there's only one section in this entire paper that is good. And it is the bit where you're talking about them deciding, I don't know if you've seen Seven Samurai, but there's a bit where they decide what their not logo, but their banner is, kind of what their symbol is. And it's because I did a sort of, visual analysis of the scene and talked about the kanji that was being used and like what the multifarious meanings of that kanji would be for the Japanese viewer, not just seeing what they said it meant, but also being able to intuit the like 3 or 4 other meanings that it would have also continued or contained. It could be kanji can mean multiple different things in Japanese, right? Also in Chinese, but like, you know, one character can mean many different things, and the word, it's not pronounced the same way, but the character is the same, right? And so I did a kind of read of that, and he was like, Austin, this is the only piece of the paper that's good, and it's because it's the only piece of the paper that you're engaging with the movie as a piece of visual media. The rest of what you're writing here is about the narrative and about the story and about the characters, and that's all fine, but like, it's not a book, you know? It's a movie. How is the visual component of this movie, you know, working? And, you know, I think you can do narrative critique of film that is about narrative first. You can do that, and you can find interesting pockets of information or thought or, you know, ideas in that style. But he was right that anytime I wanted to do a character first analysis of something, it would have been better in film. It's better if I also tie in, how is that character shot? How are they dressed? What angles is the camera looking at them from? And it's one of those things that's like, I'm not explicitly a formalist as a critic, but to dismiss the formal elements of a medium, you're missing half of what you can talk about. And you're missing parts where your point might be undercut by what the medium is saying through its actual like rules and the way that it works. You know what I mean? Like a very simple version of this that just came up. Someone, not someone I know, but I saw someone or heard about someone who thought that Gaston was the first time they watched Beauty and the Beast. They watched all of Beauty and the Beast thinking Gaston was the hero, right? And why did they think that? Why did they think that Gaston was going to be the hero? Now, lots of questions. Maybe because there's some superficial similarity between Gaston and like the woodsman in traditional fairy tales like Red Riding Hood or, the Sleeping Beauty, hero. But also, they have that song at the beginning about how cool Gaston is, and it's sarcastic. But if you don't understand that it's sarcastic, and a lot of the sarcasm is in the visual language of that scene, it's him being a big, too big of a personality, clearly a big jerk throughout that sequence, you might not get that it's sarcastic. And so you might go through that whole movie being like, damn, this is really a movie about how Gaston, got left behind unfairly. We certainly live in a world in which I promise you I could spend 2 minutes on the internet until I find some Gaston.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
I mean?
The Gaston stands are strong.
They're strong. They're going to be in the comments of this. Don't clip this section. They'll come for you. Gaston Hive is real. The Gastans.
There we go.
So using the whole part of whatever the object is in front of you is got to give you better criticism every single time, because you will, and it might undercut you in a way that's important for you to address. There's so many times that I've been like, I want to write, there's a game I want to write about or a movie I want to write about, and here's the idea I have for it. And then when I think about the way something was shot, or the way a piece of music was deployed, or the way it felt to move through the world, or something like that in a video game, suddenly my initial thought doesn't hold up in the same way. You know what I mean? A great example of this was like Monster Hunter World, a game that I really liked. Is a game that, like, on its face, I there are so many things narratively that put me off about that game, that are about, I'm not a hunting person. You know what I mean? This is a game about preparing to go out and do a hunt against a dragon, and there's a bunch of different animals, a bunch of kind of mythical creatures. And I think that a lot of the narrative stuff around it in that specific game is like extremely white man's burden-ish, manifest destiny storytelling. Like, it's wild how much it's like, we've come to the new world, but it's filled with animals that need to be eradicated. Like, that is, like, bar for bar, that is that game. But I can make that criticism, right? But I have to make that criticism while also holding the criticism that is like, it feels really good and something distinct is happening when in the middle of combat I have to go hide behind a rock to sharpen my sword. And that is like, can I put those two ideas in conversation? How do I put in conversation the materiality of what's happening in the moment-to-moment play of Monster Hunter World that feels so distinct from every other action game that isn't a Monster Hunter game, or like maybe a Dark Souls game or adjacent, with the sort of narrative idea that is kind of tossed over it like a tarp about this kind of like manifest destiny, colonial expedition stuff. How do those two things interact? What is the fantasy at play in doing all this preparatory work? Like, how do those two things inform each other? And where does my joy at one sit with my disdain for the other? How do those two things interact? And that's hard work as a writer, because it's so much easier to just pick one or the other. It's so much easier to be like, yo, I chopped that dragon's tail off and it was sick. 5 out of 5, thumbs up. Or would do it again. Or narratively, this game makes me feel like a young colonist. Like, what am I doing here? Eject. Don't buy this game. And the reality of trying to like weave those two feelings together and make them bounce off of each other is both the difficulty and the reason I did this for so long. It's fun to do that, which I think is the other thing people don't get about criticism, is that like people think, and there are people out there who maybe do it for a different reason, but for me, I'm not doing it because I'm a hater. I'm doing it, in fact, because it's joyful for me to put these ideas in conversation with one another.
Yeah, I feel like Phil and I are always talking about variations on that, and I think the flip of that is when we're like, oh, this narrative just like beautiful, hitting all the right notes, so good, but goddamn, is this not fun to play?
Yeah, which is a bummer, right? Like that feeling of like, I wish I could give myself over to this thing all the way, but what I really want is a cutscene compilation. It's just like, and it's a bummer, because it's like, that's the thing I'm here for. And I would take the opposite every time. And again, maybe this does reveal I'm a formalist. It's like, I don't know that I love where Death Stranding goes narratively. Ooh. The Hideo Kojima game about delivering packages in a post-apocalypse.
I do not love it.
But I don't. There are things I like about it. There are world-building things I like about it, but there are not there are not plot things I like about it so much. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
I think the world is wild. Like, I'm here for the world. I'm even here for some of the bad swings at characters.
Yes.
I don't love where any of it goes. However, take any 10-minute chunk of that game where I'm climbing a cliff and setting up a ladder or a zip line or a road. The feeling of like putting a road together with someone is the thesis of that game so much more than the stuff with the characters that are, you know, having bad boss fights and family reunions, you know? So it feels incredible. It feels incredible. I'm excited for the sequel of that game. There's nothing makes me not happier, but it is a good moment when someone has spent decades making one type of thing and then they get to like go make a different type of thing and really, really go for it. To me, that's like a sort of artistic freedom that is, I wish more artists had. Like, most artists don't even get to the like stable franchise tier. Most artists, regardless of medium, are stuck at like, how do I make rent? How do I make rent? Okay, I got a commission. Okay, I'm on this contract. Okay, I'm on this TV show, whatever, for a little bit of time. Okay, how do I make rent? But for those who do make it to that tier of like, oh, I'm in a pretty stable place, getting from there to like, and now I'm off doing a different thing is like, that's the dream in some ways, you know.
Yeah, I'm curious. Like, you know, over the last couple seasons of the show, we've had game developers come on and talk. Like, one aspect that comes up a lot is like developers wishing that critics or, you know, games journalists had a better understanding of how games are made, because that would influence how they talk about them. And, you know, we can get into the weeds of like, well, part of that is like there is no transparency to how games are developed, except for Double Fine's recent documentary, which, you know, we don't need to get into it. But
and they're non-standard, right? They're not the average place. And then, like, you know, you get to things like No Clip from Danny O'Dwyer. Yeah. But that's all. And I love Danny. Danny and I go back, you know. But I must say we go back like Crew Cuts, which is a deep Rhyme Fest reference, and no one cares about that. But I'm going to drop it anyway.
Real ones know.
And real ones know. But what Danny does is, and I'm not accusing Danny of anything. I'm not saying Danny gives anybody final cut, but like Danny is going into a place. They know Danny is coming into the place. In fact, we had Danny on Reset, which was the show that I was a consulting producer on for Vice, which was like a video games culture industry kind of like 30-minute, you know, Act 1, Act 2 are like behind the scenes investigation, conversation, you know, talking head things, and then the third act was like a round table with like some industry people, and it was hosted by Dexter Thomas, who I think might still be at Vice. I'm not 100% sure, but Danny came on that, and one of the things that we talked about was like, you know, Danny did a video on Final Fantasy 14, and when he showed up early in the morning with his crew, people were already there in the middle of their workday. And when he left late at night with his crew, people were still there. The videos he made were not about crunch culture at Square Enix. You know what I mean? And that's not an accusation. That's something he talked about, you know? And so I think that like when you know the camera crew is coming, you're gonna have a different level of transparency, and you're gonna put stuff in the foreground because you want to make sure it looks good and blah blah blah. So like I do think that there is a degree of like that lack of transparency is why critics sometimes don't know what it is to make a game. But also, so I'm on like almost on year 2 of making games at a fairly sizable studio now. I think we're at like 60 people, something like that. And that number's going up very quickly every month. We're hiring. And I like stand by everything I said about the stuff that I critiqued at the time. And in fact, I work with some of the people whose games I critiqued as hard as I could, right? Multiple people that I work with now were on Watch Dogs Legion, a game that I think had really high ambitions and like came in under them. And those people enjoyed my writing on the game because I engaged with the work as best as I could. You know, I don't need to know you can imagine a game that has you can imagine, let's say Breath of the Wild. This is fake. What I'm about to say is fake. Imagine I knew that, and first of all, imagine I'm someone who pretend, if you can, that I'm someone who doesn't like weapon durability in Breath of the Wild. That I'm one of the people who's like, that game is so close to perfect, but I hate that weapons break in Breath of the Wild. There are millions of those people. Imagine I knew that the idea of weapon durability was back and forth for months and months, or years and years inside of whichever Nintendo sub-team built that game. They tried it both ways. They tested it both ways. They had a third system that was like sort of like weapon durability, but you could repair the weapon. Imagine I knew all of that stuff. None of that clarifies my position of do I enjoy it or not. None of that clarifies what the work is. I imagine all the time, there was nothing in a video game that didn't come from hours of meetings or a last-minute fix that someone put in at the best of their ability when they realized something was broken, right? Like, it is amazing that anyone ships any video game, right? That doesn't mean that my response to it is going to change based on, and I know that makes me sound callous in some ways, right? But I don't know. Like, I want to respond to the work. I want to respond to what's in front of me, to what my hands can touch, my eyes can see, to what I've played and how it hits me. And if I want to talk about, I love to hear about the process of making things because that can inform my criticism of it. I love to watch a GDC talk about how some gameplay feature was designed and what they were going for. Often, what they say is, we were going for X, but we came out with Y, and it turns out Y was pretty good, you know? And this is part of why I wish there was more transparency. It's not because I think people would be, like, softer on game developers in criticism or something. I think it's because people would have a better understanding of what it is they're critiquing to begin with. The thing of, like, I don't know. I think the first response you have to a thing is often not a thing you yourself understand why you're having it. You know what I mean? Like, the thing of, like, I don't like the taste of this thing in my mouth. And then you're not sure, but is it because it's burnt? Is it because it has an ingredient you don't like the taste of? Is it because you were just brushing your teeth? Is it because, you know what I mean? Like, and I think that it can be hard to unpack that. And the job of a good critic is to unpack, why did the thing taste bad in my mouth? What was going on there in that moment? And while I think it can be good to know that the chef's tools were dirty, it doesn't change that the food tasted bad. Do you know what I mean? Like, if anything, sometimes you're like, I think about, like, the Destiny 1 thing all the time that came out of some reporting around that game that was like, oh, if they wanted to move a rock in any one of their big open world areas, they had to move the rock as the last thing they did at the end of the day, and then set the entire level to be re-rendered or whatever overnight. They couldn't get in there and move things around, which meant they couldn't test things. They couldn't test things the way that you're supposed to be able to test them because it took so long to update go from one build to the next build. And so things just got, like, really stagnant and they weren't tested right. And, like, that's an interesting story. That's an important piece of reporting about the way that game was developed. But fundamentally, it's like, the thing that I come back to is Kirk Hamilton's incredible review of that game for Kotaku at the time, which is it's like this embodied review of playing that game at launch, staring into a cave and shooting so that loot drops out. Because the game that they built is one where that was the best way to play it. And, like, I don't care. I care as a curiosity and as someone who's in game development now. I care about it, but I don't care about it in the critical sense, how it got there. I care about engaging with the work and talking about what it does. And again, that's me as an audience member and as a writer. I don't know that that's everybody. I know that it's not everybody, in fact. But I also think people have this tendency to, like, lash out at a piece of writing that isn't, like, it doesn't meet their needs, as if that piece of writing is a claim that that's what all pieces of writing should be. We got that a ton at Waypoint. It was like, why do you think every review needs to be XYZ? I was like, we don't believe that. We believe our reviews need to be X, Y, and Z, and so we're writing those ones. But, like, you got to understand, we don't get IGN traffic. Why are you mad at us? You know what I mean? Most people are looking at reviews that look nothing like our reviews. Why are you so heated up about these also being in the pit, you know? And I don't know. People have strong feelings about what is and isn't a review.
Are there things that are different from you as you've moved from, criticism to development? And are there different parts of your brain that you're using, or like, is there a different kind of fun that you're having when you're kind of engaging with it in that way?
I'm getting a little bit of the academia thing of like the long-term project again, right? Which is like, it takes a long time to make a game. And so like, I have a terrible title, which is IP director. It's a good title in some ways. It's a bad title because like intellectual property is a hell phrase, that represents a lot of like terrible things with the world. It means chief world builder and like lead writer, which is nice, but also because it's IP director, it means I do get to like elbow my way into certain conversations and say stuff like, now that wouldn't be good for the IP if we did XYZ. And like that, there's a little bit of a benefit from that. But fundamentally, it means that I'm working on a longer time scale again. I'm not working on the 1 week turnaround or the 2 week or 1 month turnaround that media comes with. Generally, for the spaces we're in, right? Obviously, there's long-term reporting. Of course there is. I don't want to be dismissive of that. But in video games, the amount of people who are doing long-term reporting is very, very slim. And they often have to contend with also doing daily reporting or daily criticism on top of that. And so like part of what I get is that where I'm like, I've been working on this game now for almost 2 years, and some of the questions I had about our game 2 years ago are still questions I'm solving today in terms of what my part of the job is, right? And that's exciting. That means I do get to spend that long term. But in terms of my general position, again, like I know more quickly why something might be the way it is when I see something bug out in a game. When I see like placeholder voice acting get played instead of like the real voice acting or something, like, oh damn, yeah, someone XYZ. Do you know what I mean? Like like I get some of that stuff now. But generally speaking, I think my positions have been pretty consistent. Which is that like, and maybe that comes from me having already known a lot of devs and having spoken to them about the realities of development, right? That like, I already knew game dev was a mess. I already knew that none of this stuff was clean, that you didn't get like a design doc that then you implement over the course of a few years and it never changes. You know what I mean? Like all of that stuff is still, it's what it was. It's what I thought it would be. It is what it is, So thankfully I haven't had too many big changes. I think the biggest thing is I don't do much criticism anymore, especially for video games. Like, my criticism at this point is Star Wars stuff with A More Civilized Age. And that's just like it's a different beast, you know what I mean? I'm not doing, like, truly, like, the difference between, like, watching Andor last year and taking good notes and doing some reading, like, that part of it's all still the same, but it's not the same as picking up a controller and playing something for 50 hours and being there in this other way. Not, like, immersed necessarily, but, like, the process of picking up a controller and playing a video game feels different to me, phenomenologically, than sitting down and watching a 2-hour or hour-long TV show and writing some notes about it and doing some research. And so, like, that is just gone from my life at this point. Though when I play video games, I do still sometimes take notes. I maybe went back and played, like, 15 hours of Anthem 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago, a month ago. And I absolutely opened up the notes I took from when I first played that game and thought I'd be reviewing it and added new notes there because you never know. You never know when you might come back to something. It's still built that way. Yeah. Well, the thing that happened with Anthem, and now I get to tell this little story really quick, is the reason I went back to it is I was watching my friend Dre play some mech game on the Friends at the Table Twitch account, twitch.tv/Friends at the Table. And I was like, damn. And I was playing Destiny after the Destiny 2 DLC had dropped and was kind of disappointed in that. It was like the very beginning of that drop. So like before the quality of life changes were really clear. And when it was just like kind of the mid-story stuff that felt really, really tacked on. I was like, damn. I just really wish someone made mech Destiny. Like, that would be my, like, as grody as it sounds, that would be my forever game. And someone in the chat was like, well, what about Anthem? And I was like, well, obviously Anthem isn't it. Because Anthem, first of all, obviously those are exosuits and not mechs. Obviously. They're different. Come on. Very clear. But two, I was like, you're right. Let me try it again. Let me jump back in and see how it goes. Like, it failed as a game in terms of a live service game, but like maybe under new, it's a new day. They never like did the big refix of that game. They killed the like Anthem Next thing that they were going to do, where they're going to try to fix that and give it a second shot. But maybe what's there now is still compelling. So I started a new character. I went in with no expectations. I spent like 10 hours being like, you know what? Feels good to fly around. Feels good to do these abilities. Feels kind of cool to get some loot. Feels cool to like fly under this waterfall. And then somewhere along the line, I looked up. I wanted to see like, where's the community for this game at now? And I found a YouTube video of someone who was like trying to be the guy. Like
the Anthem guy.
He was the Anthem guy on YouTube. In fact, I want to say his name was
Anthem guy.
Literally
Anthem guy.
Anthem guy.
Let's go.
Or something like truly something like that. It was Your Anthem on YouTube.
Close enough.
Literally Your Anthem. Very nice guy. And if you go to his page, if you go to Your Anthem game on YouTube, dozens of Anthem videos from 2 to 3 years ago. Just dozens of them. Cataclysm's finally been released. Cataclysm starts soon. BioWare responds. More Cataclysm leaks. New Strongholds leaks. Is Anthem in legal trouble? The truth about Anthem. Like, just dozens and dozens, and he was gonna be the guy. And then that game didn't need a guy, because that game basically got canceled after it was released, right? And I just got really sad about it, because it's like, here's a person who... The last video on his account was... Anthem's development ended. News and details. Anthem has been canceled. 110K views. And like the one before that was Anthem second anniversary news and details. Like he was like ready for the rejuvenation of it. And he sounds so defeated. He sounds so defeated in the Anthem has been canceled video. He's like, some other stuff is going to come out soon. Maybe I'll pivot my channel to that. He did not.
Oh, this is a full bore tragedy.
Greek tragedy.
Truly. So then I'm like, damn, what's going on with this guy? And I was trying to track him down. I couldn't figure out, like, did he change his name? Does he have another YouTube channel? What's going on? And then I clicked on live, and it turns out a month ago, so at the time, like 2 weeks prior, he did a 4-year anniversary stream with 2 of his best friends that he met through Anthem, and his wife, who he met at an Anthem meetup years prior. And now, and in the time since then, because of the Anthem meetups, he ended up getting like a job, and he ended up getting like an opportunity to be like one step above influencer, or one step below consultant, or like what's the job title I'm thinking of?
Like community manager,
professional consultant. No, below that, like outside, like a critic, like a company hires a critic to come in and do a consultancy on a game before it comes out. There's like a word for this. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about, right? Where like,
yeah.
Like N-Guy Kroll went and did this for like a decade.
Yep.
I think Jeff Green does it now. Shout outs to them, 2 incredible people who mentored me for a little while, which was great. Anyway, he got that role, and then from that he got like some roles working on some indie games, and now he's doing community management stuff. I want to say at Ubisoft or something. And so it's like Anthem ended up like, and then he did this stream, this like 4-hour stream replaying his favorite stuff of Anthem with his wife and his 2 other good friends. And I was like, you know what?
I'm back in.
Anthem,
that
baby.
fucks.
I'm
That's
back
great.
in.
Tell everyone
So
we're back up.
We're back. Yeah, that's right. I'm thinking we're back. Then I played 5 more hours of Anthem, and I was like, I gotta stop playing this game. It's back. It doesn't hold up. I hit the grind. I hit the middle of that game where you stop getting new abilities and you just start like every fight is the same. It doesn't have the progression system it needs, etc. And like, all right, I'm gonna close those notes. But who knows? When that game is about to get canceled, I'll go back. I'll start a 3rd character. I'll add some more notes. Maybe I'll send out a newsletter. You never know. The thread is always there. So I don't think it ever leaves you. That's the thing. Once you start thinking about things like this, you're always looking for angles, or I am anyway. Once I decided I'm going to write critically about media, I'm never not in that mode. And I know that sounds exhausting, and there are times when it can be tiring, but it's mostly because it's fun that I do it. You know what I mean? I'm mostly engaged in a positive, lean forward way, not in a like... It's not like I'm looking for things to tear apart. It's like I want to know what this thing is doing and why I'm responding to it, And that hasn't left me in the world of game dev either, right? Where like I'm constantly thinking about how would this hit me as a player? How is this world building? Like, what's this evoke? Hey, I'm making a decision about a character's name. What am I trying to evoke with this? What is the idea that I'm trying to like bring to bear? What is the emotional experience I'm trying to give somebody when I use a certain collection of sounds? You know what I mean? And I do that all the time with friends at the table anyway, so it's not like it's like a new thing necessarily, but it's like that's the day job now, and that's different. So yeah, that's how that transition has been.
I dig that. I mean, I recently transitioned into game development at the beginning of the year as well, and like similar to Ben, like went to grad school for creative writing, and like my background is in creative nonfiction writing specifically. So like when you say all the stuff about like, you know, reading a piece of criticism or some kind of personal anecdote or personal essayistic element enters the chat, like that's the shit I'm all about. You know, yeah, I think kind of being on the game development side of things has been interesting in that when I first started, I feel like I was getting the feeling like, oh, it's going to fundamentally change how I talk about games. But Ben, I was just thinking, we recently recorded a Resident Evil episode, just talking about like the remake, and Ben's playing Resident Evil 2 remake, and I was writing a column piece about Resident Evil 4 remake, and I was just thinking like, it hasn't, like, knowing a little bit more about game development actually hasn't changed much of how I talk about games, but maybe it's changed like the things that I find interesting, like in the same way that like
that
a good, you know, piece of criticism or a good like theoretical framework kind of changes how you engage if you're given the time to interact with it.
I mean, like a great example for this for me is this new Tears of the Kingdom. Breath of the Wild sequel trailer or like gameplay video that came out a few weeks ago, that revealed like all new gameplay mechanics where like I would have already been hyped on those probably, but being on the dev side and thinking about what that means for the core gameplay loop, maybe that does hit me harder now in terms of what a big undertaking that is. Are we talking about? I don't know how spoiler free
Go at
are
it.
about
Yeah,
this stuff. All right. Tears of the Kingdom's new thing. One of the new things, it seems, on top of like some new mobility options for Link, includes like putting things in the world together with a sort of like sticky glue, objects into one another, but then also like just items in the world. So like they show a player building a boat. They showed in the most recent trailer Link piloting a really janky mech comprised of 4 big stone tablets, like sort of thrown, like just slates of stone, like put together in a rectangle or cube type thing, with a lever on top. Tons of that like player expressivity stuff. And the response to the gameplay video had been like, well, this is still just DLC, or some of the response. A lot of the response was like, yo, but there was a subset of people who are like, the same map, same game. It's the same game, basically. This is basically
it's an add-on, yeah.
And it's like, right. And to be clear, I think even before I was in dev, I would have been like, you're out of your heads. This is a huge change in the way the game is going to feel. But being in dev, I guess I would say I do understand maybe a little bit more, or it's more front of mind. It's not something I didn't understand before, but it's way more front of mind. The idea that, like, that's something that's going to come up every 50 seconds to 5 minutes, which means that's the game. Like, the game is different now, in a bigger way. And the developers are thinking about that when they're building all of the level design, when they're doing all the level design, when they're doing all the stage layout, when they're doing everything. Somewhere in that thought is, oh, they could put these 2 tree branches together to do something wild. That's a huge difference in the way you're thinking about the game. And I think maybe the other thing that is different, but again, I knew this before. You know, it's a classic thing that you hear when you interview devs is the best stuff I made was at the end of development because I understood my own tool set, right? I understood how to make the game. You know, a common thing you might hear about game development, I don't know who this comes from originally, is that like if you compare film to video game development, the big difference is in video games you have to build the camera every time, right? You and you do to some degree, but also sometimes you get to make a sequel. And obviously they're building their own camera, like not literally the camera, but the the object of design, the core thing of like, again, in Tears of the Kingdom, it looks like putting two things together is like one of these core verbs that's unique. That's clearly a new thing that they built. But the fact that they don't literally have to rebuild the camera controls, they don't have to rebuild every inch of territory or how ground exists, how characters move. Fundamentally, they have a groundwork. Part of why I'm so excited about that game is like, they're getting to make it after having already made one of these. They are going to be good at that stuff. It doesn't mean the game is going to be perfect. Maybe I'll end up disappointed by it. It's happened. You know what I mean? I've come into stuff super hyped and come out been like, damn, rough. But for them to make Breath of the Wild and then go right into making this means there's a lot of stuff that they would have learned, and they're going to have those lessons. So that's something that's a lot more front of mind for me in this kind of hype cycle moment, versus just judging what's in the trailer. Again, when I get to the game, I'm going to care about what's in the game. But when I see a sort of like snapshot of a game, I do feel like my judgment of it is a little more informed by some of my dev experiences. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I think that adds up to me. How has your game dev experience been generally?
Good. Yeah, I think it's, so I went to school for creative writing, but then after I graduated during the pandemic, like in my MFA, I ended up getting a job in marketing in like a tech startup that was just like soul sucking. So just at a base level, it's like so much better to be around creative people. But I think more so than that, unlike you, who, since you had talked to a lot of developers over your career, you kind of had a better sense of how games were. I kind of came in. I'm basically an editor currently and doing like some narrative design and some narrative work, but the game's coming out fairly soon, so kind of on the tail end. And
are y'all announced? Can you talk about anything yet? Because this is the other thing that sucks. This is the part that sucks the most about being in game.
Thirsty Suitors is coming out this year.
Oh, you're on Thirsty Suitors. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Exciting.
So, one of the things I have been bringing up is like when I came in as an editor, I thought like I would just get a script, like just like a huge document with everything, and I just go through it, and then that'd be it. And then obviously like that's not the case. Like we use ink, so there's like zillions of files, and you have to edit each one individually, and each time you edit one, you have to implement it into the game, and it's just very collaborative, as you know.
It's like, where is the source of truth?
Yeah.
Is it in the document, or is it in the game? Is it on a page on like some other sort of like wiki style database that you run? Is it on Jira? Like, where is the truth at? And what are you responsible for doing upkeep for? And what do you do when there's a difference of opinion about where the source of truth is, or about like all that stuff is like, it's collaborative, and it's technological collaboration. Especially, I don't know, are you remote?
And it's fully remote team, so like everything, you're working off a server, and like things are changing rapidly all the time. So, I mean, it's been really fun. And I think like as a Black person, being able to work with other, people of color that have kind of interesting worldviews, like that's been really exciting. And I kind of just want to work on like the start of a project, like I think like where you coming in at possibility space and kind of being able to work from the beginning on whatever y'all are working on, I bet that's been like really interesting. And like maybe to segue this off of me, one of the questions we had was like friends at the table and how that fits into your ethos with other things you're creating, and hearing that as the IP director, you're doing things like world building. I'm curious, like, do those kind of analog pretty closely, those skills you were doing with friends at the table, or are you finding it's a different experience?
There are similarities and there are differences. High level ethos is the same, which is collaboration forward. Friends at the Table is an actual play podcast, a tabletop role-playing game podcast where we play tabletop games together. And I think one of the things that we strive for is collaboration in every aspect. We talk about I don't show up with a story and go, okay, we're going to run through my story. I show up with some world building. I show up with lots of questions, and I help those questions fill in the gaps and produce interesting moments and like drive us towards drama. And so a lot of that ethos is still there, in the sense that like my goal is not to like produce a book about the world for the game we're making and be like, all right, here it is, implement it. It's to work with narrative designers. It's to work with gameplay designers and talk about how those things can inform each other and make sure that we're all making a product that we're all super excited about. That sounded so corny to say out loud. But that is the thing, right? Like, that is the ethos, is still that. And the ethos is critical world building, you know, which is shorthand for like world building that cares about what it means. You know, it is materialist world building in the sense that like it is not. I like to build worlds that are interested in things like class dynamics and think about history as an actual thing that like matters, and it's not just like a list of events. It's like those events have to like have effects, have knock-on effects, and have to come from somewhere. And like I like to have that is like what moves me as a world builder, or like that's one way I think about world building, right? So that stuff is all still there. There's stuff that isn't, right? Which is that like Friends of the Table is a show where what we do is we get excited about a tabletop game, and then I bounce off that tabletop game to help build a world around it. Here's an example. We're currently in a season called Palisade, which is a season about giant magical mechs. It's the sequel to a season called Partisan, which was about giant non-magical mechs. I mean, all mechs are metaphorically magical in my heart, and are also kind of figuratively magical because they're not real. There's a good reason why militaries don't use big humanoid mechs. It's a fake idea, right? Don't do it. Also, if you do it, or you see someone doing it, don't send it to me all excited. I don't want to see mechs be real. They're terrifying. Like, that's not a thing I'm hyped about. But in Beam Saber, which is a Forged in the Dark game designed by Austin Ramsey, the way mechs have the way that they play is you have a mech, you have a vehicle that has a number of like special quirks about it. Like it might have like loud afterburners, or it might have a like intense targeting system or something. As a player, you make those. And when you would get damaged inside of your mech, instead of you taking damage or you taking stress, the machine's quirk gets damaged instead. So you lose your loud afterburners. And in fact, they might get damaged so bad that they become unreliable loud afterburners instead. So the mechs in that game are all about being a shell for the person. You're inside of it. You're in it like a suit of armor. It protects you. It takes the damage for you. It has its own set of characteristics that you take on when you're inside of it. In the game we're playing for this season, Armor Astir, which is by a game by Breyer. What is Breyer's last name? I'm gonna get this real quick because I have it right here. Why am I Sovereign? Of course, Breyer Sovereign, who I just had lunch with not that long ago. Shout out to Breyer. That is not true. In Armor Astir, when your mech takes damage, when your mech gets put in danger, you get put into danger too. So this is a fundamentally different truth about the world for me, right? In one of these games, the mech is a metaphor for the thing you cover yourself in, the thing that does things you wish you could do. And in the other, it's a metaphor for you yourself, right? And so I'm going to build different worlds around those rule sets. One of those is going to be a world or a setting that's about people hiding themselves behind things. It's going to be about factions providing cover for actions. It's going to be a world that's like a little more cold and removed, a little more mechanical. And then in Armor Astir, which Armor Astir also has all this other cool stuff going on around like different magical approaches. So for instance, like if your mech has arcane magic, it's strong against divine magic, but it's weak against mundane attempts, to attack you, stuff like that. All of that stuff informs how I build the world. And these are both in the same like broad setting, but I almost think of them as like different TV shows that like treat the camera, the way the camera like moves and focuses on things is like different, right? Like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones are both fantasy shows, or fantasy fiction, but they're both very different in how like the focus, or literally in the film adaptation and the TV show, the camera frames things differently. You know what I mean? And so I think about that a lot. So like the world that we're building in Palisade is a lot less about people being able to hide behind things. You can't really hide behind anything. You're out there. You're in danger. You're being put, at the end of a blade. You're going to end up not being able to hide behind these big robots. And when they get hurt, that's symbolic of you getting hurt in some ways. It's symbolic about you getting entangled in something. And so I have to build a world that supports that. In video game development, some of that ain't there yet. That's just game. You know what I mean? Like, video games don't have all of their, and again, this is why I'm excited about Tears of the Kingdom. They're kind of getting there early. They already had that when they started making Tears of the Kingdom to some degree. So they could build around it instead of find it along the way. And so in another great example, this is like the Dark Souls versus Elden Ring thing, right? In Dark Souls, the world building very much was built along the way. And so part of the reason why you end up getting references to places that like don't actually ever show up in the series is because Miyazaki and co like wrote those, at mile marker 8 of 10 to be like, and then that's where the Witches of Izalith are from. They're from a place called Izalith. They didn't know what Izalith was at day one. In Elden Ring, they started with all this world building and were able to integrate it deeply from the jump, so you would go to those places right away. And so that's like a distinct difference. And also when you're writing the Elden Ring lore, you kind of get what like a Souls-like is. Like, I don't know that George R. R. Martin like sat down and played a lot of Dark Souls, but he certainly was given lots of documentation and videos about what the gameplay would feel like, that it was this kind of, style of disciplined play where the player has learned how to move slowly and make, very precise decisions about when they're attacking, and they're committed to their attacks and blah, 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 blah. All of that writing can be informed by the feel of what that game is. And so for me now, working on a game from the jump, you don't have all that stuff yet. You know what I mean? You have a design for a lot of it, but some of it's just not there yet. Some of that you're figuring it out. You're testing. You're seeing what works. You're seeing what doesn't. You're seeing what's fun. You're seeing what's not fun. You're seeing what's in line with, and sometimes you also get the other thing, which I'm grateful for, is you get gameplay designers who are like, well, I want to make something that's in tune with your world building. Whereas when I'm playing a tabletop game, I don't have that back and forth with the tabletop game designer. I got a book in my hands, and I'm like, it says here that arcane magic is strong against divine magic, but weak against mundane approaches, right? And like, how do I build off of that? And so in some ways, that's actually been tough for me. I love bouncing off of mechanics, and so if those aren't done, it can be harder for me to do what I like to do, which is interpretive sometimes, and like, ooh, this is like a little engine I can pull on. This is a little seed that I can start to play with. Do you know what I mean? And that, I think, in some ways, I think like that's kind of how you end up with the world building that sticks to you. Again, I don't love a lot of the plot in Death Stranding, but when I think about the world building in it, I get how you get there from, I want to make a game where I climb a bunch of rocks and build some roads and zip lines. How do we get a world that supports what that is? The world building in that game, it absolutely supports it. It's super weird and cool. The plot, which like I don't know what the writing order is on that, like doesn't feel like it emerges from the gameplay necessarily. It feels very much stapled on. And so I think that's the biggest difference between Friends at the Table and what I'm doing now is like I'm making world building decisions without some of the engine, or not the engine, but like the engine, lowercase e engine, not gameplay engine, but like, metaphorical engine of gameplay design being totally firmed up, and that's about as close as I can talk about a project that's unannounced. I'm sure that's understandable.
Yeah. It kind of sounds like in some ways, like there's maybe a little bit more collaboration with Friends at the Table where you're like working with people. And I'm wondering with your work presently, is it like a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Like you're trying to find a set, like concrete world that you can kind of bounce off of.
It's interesting. It's like, I think the collaboration is still there. It's first and foremost, I have a team of writers, right? I have two great writers who I am like thrilled to work with on an everyday basis, Tara and Olivia, who are brilliant and who bring things to the table that I don't have, which is the most important part of, the collaborative process, is that like, I can be very self-serious, and it's really good to have people who are either self-serious in a different way than I am, or don't take something as seriously as I do, or where they take something seriously that I think I can be very jokey about, because that blend ends up pushing us all towards something much, much stronger. So I do have direct collaboration in that method. I think it's less that's like we're building a world to bounce off of. It's more that it's more about the building the world and then building stuff around the world. Like, my team is not narrative designers. There's a different team that's narrative designers who we work with very closely, but there's something very different about being like, here are the bare bones of a place in the world or a story idea or whatever, and then they go and make the stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's a different experience. It's different from Friends at the Table, where I'm doing both of those things, with my friends, but also like there's a point at which it's like I'm going in the lab, I'm gonna put together an adventure for people, I'm gonna put together a situation or something like that. This is all stuff that like I cannot wait to talk about in greater detail, because talking around it is just impossible. You know what I mean? Once we announce and once it's clear what I've been working on, I think a lot of things will snap into place around like why I left Waypoint to come do this, and why the team is the team that it is, and all that stuff is just going to be very clear. But I think that there is a degree of like to talk about it really means talking about it really, and until I can, which again, this is the transparency thing. I wish I could. Yeah. I wish I could be like, all right, here's the thing we're doing, but part of that lack of transparency comes from the sense that you need every single competitive advantage you can just to like to succeed, which is not me projecting about like our competitive edge in the market as a particular product. But you think about, it always bugs me out when I see people talk about like how much money the games industry makes. Like I don't know what the current numbers are, but like the games industry makes such and such billions of dollars in revenue this year. It's bigger than film. You often hear that, right? That's like such a bad figure. And if you do any reporting, that's like playing with numbers in a goofy way, especially when games are $60 or $70 in many cases, right? You might, a game might drop when Tears of the Kingdom comes out. It's going to make a fucking boatload of money. It still might not have been seen or played by as many people as that money suggests. You know what I mean? And more importantly, everybody is one flop away from losing their job. This is an industry where the numbers are big, but they're big both on cost and revenue. Especially for AAA games, but even bigger indie games are so expensive to make now that you need those high revenue figures, or companies believe they need those high revenue figures in order to continue employing people and keeping stuff going. And often that's what their goals are outlandish. I think about the Tomb Raider reboot games and the number Square Enix expected to get from those, and how Eidos was just kind of like at the end of a knife on that stuff, because like they weren't going to get those numbers. They weren't going to get them. No matter how good those games were, like it was just, you had to have hit in a different scale of way than what anybody was hitting at that point. But like the games are genuinely very expensive to make, and so it's one thing to be like, oh, look at all the money that's coming in revenue, and it's a different thing to be like, okay, but like, where did the EA originals go? You know what I mean? Why ain't they making a Mirror's Edge anymore? You know what I mean? And the answer is because like they weren't making money. All this stuff is so much more of a tightrope than anybody in the industry likes to say it is, because if you say it is, you lose investors. Right? You can't come out and say, and this is like one of the hardest things in the world, is the thing of like, it's not one of the hardest things in the world. I'm like, what am I talking about? I've worked hard jobs before. You know what I mean? As a person who is, one of the things in creative fields that is difficult, let me hyperbolize it. A difficult thing for me, and anyone in a creative field, is walking the tightrope between putting your chest out and giving the best version of your success story, and being like, we have X millions of listeners or whatever, all time, and it's like an all-time figure, which means nothing. Do you know what I mean? If you're a long-running podcast, if you're a long-running publication, and you're like, we have X millions of readers over the last decade, it's like, all right, that doesn't mean nothing, but it kind of means nothing. What do you get per day? How many people are on your site right now? That's what people actually care about. And so there's this hard, tightrope between putting your chest out and giving the best possible, most generous version of your story that makes you seem very successful, and then being clear to your audience that you are not necessarily as big and as stable as you maybe sometimes portray, because you need their support in order to keep the lights on. That's like a really difficult tightrope to walk sometimes. I saw somebody compare Friends at the Table to Welcome to Night Vale recently, and they called them both behemoths of the podcasting scene. And it's like, bro, we ain't the same. Like, Night Vale does numbers. You know what I mean? Like, Night Vale is like 100 times bigger than us or something. You know what I mean? And like, I get it. Friends at the Table is 100 times bigger than the average podcast that someone makes with their friends, like 100%. But like, the difference between those, it's a different tax bracket. You know what I mean? Like, and that's it's a tough, weird thing to be like, okay. And this is the Waypoint thing too, right? Like, Waypoint at its height, and Waypoint's still doing good now. I cannot be any more proud of the way that they like picked up the ball and ran with it. They've been doing great with the subscription model stuff. I'm so happy that we got the subscription model stuff through before I left. That was like a huge like weight off my chest, because it was something we'd worked on for years and tried to do, and then finally it lined up and we kind of like pushed it through. And one day we'll tell that whole story, in even greater detail than it's already out there. But there Waypoint always, and a lot of this had to do with, for instance, Danica being just incredible on socials. Waypoint could be the conversation on any given day. And, we were a profitable company. I tell this story a lot, that like, we were more profitable at any given time than, say, Noisy, Vice's music site. But Noisy's not profitable was tens of millions. Noisy was like, this is a fake number, I'm making it up, but it's not that far off from what I remember, was making, again, this isn't, don't sue me, let's say 28 million a year, but was costing 30 million a year. Whereas we were making 3 million a year, but only cost 2 million a year. And if you're Vice, if you're any media company, you're going to invest more in Noisy, because it feels like if Noisy hits, they're going to have a $40 million a year, and that's going to be $10 million profit. Whereas if we have that sort of growth, what do we have, a $4 million a year? Who cares? They don't care, right? That's the way that shook out at the time under that leadership, which, by the way, is like 2 regimes of leadership ago. So like, those numbers are so far in the past, it's not real. This is, forever ago now. Please don't sue me. But like, that was the situation where it was like, okay, well, how do we present Waypoint as being this sizable new kid on the block who's here to take names and like be part of the conversation and dominate? But also, like, we're not at Polygon's level, let alone the IGN Kotaku level. You know what I mean? But readership doesn't really understand the difference between those things. And this comes back to the criticism thing, right? Which is like, well, of course they don't. What they care about is like, is the article good? Is the review good? Is the podcast good? And in some ways, is it hypocritical of me to be like, I wish the audience understood more about the industry side of this, so that they would cut us some slack. Because it's like, that's the same thing I'm saying I won't do for game development, right? So, maybe do as I say and not as I do. I don't know. But it's tough. That particular thing, I think, is one of the things that I stick with a lot, is like, I do wish there was a little more transparency in the games industry and a little more honesty about how precarious things were sometimes. Not because I think that like that should mean that you should go support every game in the world or whatever, but because I think I get put off really bad when people are fronting about how important their shit is, or about how big it is, or they feel like they need to prove something. Like, the worst thing in the world for me in the games industry is like when the games industry tries to beat its chest about being a big industry, about being art, if it doesn't also want to like live that for real. You know what I mean? So, it's tough.
I guess, first of all, how's your time looking? I don't want to abuse you.
I could go a little bit longer.
I think maybe we'll like ask like one or two more questions. This just you teed this up. You perked my little ears I think the thing that I'm thinking about is, in some ways I think that the game industry does that because it's this reflexive, like, well, yeah, please don't cut the Washington Post like game reporting. It's important. Like, it's a huge industry.
Yes.
Like, please,
Yes.
Please. And I think like some of it is just this reflexive, like, let us exist. And maybe you can talk about, Phil and I kind of had this conversation with Natalie about like, where is the games journalism industry? Because from the outside, it's not looking great. It's not feeling great.
It's not feeling great. I don't know. It is in a weird place right now. I mean, I think to some degree this is like, if you asked me where it was going 5 years ago, I'd be like, oh, we're going to see way more layoffs. We're going to see a continued shift towards independent YouTubers taking up time and becoming the de facto places that people go to for games coverage. We're going to see more mainstream outlets cut back or eliminate their on staff games media folks, or they'll get rolled into something bigger, like the tech part of the site, or the arts part of the site, or the publication. We'll probably see even a big reduction in some of the biggest publications that are game centric. And it's like all that happened. You know what I mean? Like, we all knew all of this was coming. I don't think anybody in 2018 was like, games media is going to keep growing. But then it happened, and it's different to think it's going to happen than it is to live in it and to feel like, like it really feels empty in here sometimes, which is of course not true. There are tons of people doing games media stuff. There are more sites today than there probably ever have been in terms of small sites that are, doing what we would have called blogging 10 years ago. But it feels like there used to be more behemoths in the room. The positives, here's what positives I'll say. I think IGN's in like a surprisingly good place in terms of like who's over there in terms of reporting and criticism. They have some really great folks over there these days. And that's not to diminish Polygon or Kotaku or anything else, but like for a long time, inside of the critical sphere, people made fun of IGN as like not being serious or not hiring people who were serious about games. It was like there was a real, in a pejorative sense, that's a fanboy website. That's like a site for people who like just want to see the score. You know what I mean? And I think over the last 5 years or so, they have over the time brought in some people and turn out pretty good stuff pretty regularly. And that's the biggest gaming website either is or is in that top. It's up. It's one or two every time, right? The way GameSpot, however, has been like slowly chipped away at as it's been sold over and over again is like a heartbreaker, because I spent some time doing freelance stuff for GameSpot. GameSpot had some really great people over the last 20 years on and off, as we all know, and seeing like that site fall apart in some ways. And again, there's still good people there, but like the budget ain't what it used to be, and the front page ain't what it used to be. Has been very weird. And those are just big. Those are two big sites, right, to talk about. But then, like in that middle area, when you see the layoffs that hit places, when you see things like US Gamer closing and Eurogamer getting layoffs, and you see Rock Paper Shotgun, which still has great people, but their model shifting a little bit as ownership seems like it pushes things in new directions. When you see people who want to do good reporting work spinning off to do stuff like People Make Games instead of being full-time employed by a media company, that it's awesome that like. That's happening because People Make Games have put out some great stuff. I'm like so afraid for when someone tries to sue the hell out of them, because they are not going to have the money that a big media company has to protect them, which is of course like this is part of the trade. That this is one of those things that I think audiences maybe don't have insight into sometimes, or readership doesn't, is that like the reason why you don't see a lot of the reason why there might be stories that don't get run as early as you want them to, or the reason why you see that people will, in my experience, it is like stories can get killed by legal because they don't think that it's a safe story to run. They don't think they're going to get sued. into oblivion in the post-Peter Thiel Gawker
Yep.
era, right? That happened to us at Waypoint. Like, my biggest professional failing was like failing to get this story through the door that we had ready to go. That was super important to us. That legal just ended up pulling Patrick off of for bullshit reasons. I will never be. This is one of two things that like almost made me walk. The other thing was Rockstar putting pressure on us to stop covering labor stuff around Red Dead Redemption 2 through like back channels at Vice, because there were connections between like executives at Vice and executives at Rockstar from years before. I was out of the office when this happened. I would have quit. If I had been in office, I would have quit, but I was in Vancouver on a trip with some friends, and so I wasn't there to like hear it happen live. So that's my second biggest like in my crawl. But that thing of like game media reporting on things like labor conditions, on things like sexual misconduct cases, is always running up against the fear from legal teams that you're going to get sued into oblivion. And so while I'm really happy when I see people like Chris Bratz people make games and do a great job of reporting on stuff like the Roblox stuff, I'm always terrified of like, okay, well, when is the big company going to stomp on this independent reporter who has done great work, but who is putting themselves and I think that what we've seen is they're being very careful about how they put out content to try to keep themselves safe, but you truly never know, and you can be bullied in a courtroom. And so like I'm terrified of that happening and scaring off people from doing that sort of work. I think the one that hits me the hardest is just the state of games criticism is not where it was. Maybe that's untrue. The state of game criticism is a different thing now. There's a lot more of it on YouTube. And I am not a big YouTube crit person, with some exceptions. I really like Umbrella Terms. I really like the stuff that Aaron Signal does. I really like Jacob Geller's stuff. There are people who I like, and even some of the people who I just said, I've watched a lot of Harry's videos, H-Bomber guy, right? But even like those, and shout outs to Harry, because I'm going to say something that's like critical of it, is like, and this is about the taste in my mouth more than Harry's work process. My man, you make 3 or 4 hour videos, and sometimes it would be better if it was a 10-page article or a 5-page, piece, or which is to say a 15-minute or 30-minute video. And that's the editor in me speaking. Like, find your argument, make your argument, identify it, and that's just how video just doesn't live in my life the same way that words do. You know what I mean? The same way that text does. I would rather do the long read that takes me an hour to read, or that takes me 45 minutes to read, than I like am not in a place in my life where I can put on a 3 or 4 hour video about Deus Ex. You know what I mean? And I've watched that video because I found the time to do it eventually. But like that to me is a stronger piece if it's super edited down, has a thesis, argues for that thesis with textual evidence, and like is straightforward. And so my point being that a decade ago there was a ton of that work, which I really love, and again, this is my personal bias in some ways, and it was being shared on social media platforms which were still emerging at that time. You could still feel excited about them, like Twitter, and it felt like there was a real discursive space. People argued with each other about their critical takes in ways that were elucidating and enlightening about what they were trying to say. People, I would write a blog and someone would respond to my blog and I would respond to their blog, and we would get somewhere with that. And what I don't see in the YouTube space so much is that as often. I don't see Jacob Geller releasing a video and then Campster being like, now actually, here's my counter to that, or here's how I'm going to build off a point that you said, and da-da-da-da-da. That's just not how YouTube is built necessarily. You know what I mean? YouTube just isn't set up in that same way. That's not the culture of it. Whereas like the culture of the blogosphere era was so much about bouncing ideas and picking up from one person's new thing and like and putting your spin on it and then like pushing it back out into the world. And that bred a generation of critics that are really good, I think, which is the generation right before me and through the generation right after me, because we were all kind of like in that mixer all the time. And that partly also comes from a privileged position of like being on Twitter early enough to like build an audience that cared about our work and that would share our work, and it not yet being so overwhelmingly big that it was hard to find an audience in that space. But like, you know, even before I was at Giant Bomb, I had a small readership of people who liked when I wrote stuff, and you know, a non-insignificant portion of them were also writing stuff and responding to the stuff I wrote, whether that was through a Twitter thread or through a post of their own somewhere. And that has just dried the fuck up. And that breaks my heart, because it's not like games have stopped coming out. You know what I mean? Like, I want to see more people writing about games. I want to see more people being and that stuff. Again, Critical Distance still collects, you know, posts and essays and opinion pieces every week. Like, that stuff is still happening, but it is not at the energy level that it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. I also just generally think we're also in the middle of, like, I don't know, like, is the vibe shift real? I don't know. Yes, it is. I said this on my like last Waypoint Radio episode, I think, but like, there really was a back to brunch moment in criticism post election with Biden winning, where and partly it's more than just, it's not about the Biden election, to be clear. I mean, it's a little bit about the Biden election. It's a little bit about COVID. It's a little bit about a generation of people who like learned all the vocabulary of social justice without necessarily learning the grammar of social justice or the ethos of it, and have become like very much social media police instead of educators. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right? And that's not me being like, fuck cancel culture. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not that, but there's a difference between doing important cultural criticism and even an important call out, you know, of something, versus I'm going to eliminate you from my social circle because I'm going to find a way to do it using the code words that I've learned, which I think there are some younger internet users who've mapped their established kind of the kind of normative social policing tactics and are using social justice terminology to do that, which is different than substantive critique or substantive experiential discussion about how they experienced being in a social group, experienced misogyny, or experienced gatekeeping, or any of that stuff. Like, all that stuff is good. We need to keep doing that. I'm not saying back off on that. I'm saying that there has been a shift in some ways away from substantive critique generally. So what we've seen is, like, one, a lot of people get bored of political criticism of games now, and they don't lend the sort of generosity that was being lent at the point when I was writing a lot of stuff, where, like, you know, there were definitely people who dismissed my writing at the time as being like overtly political or being biased or being leftist or being whatever, right? But generally speaking, there were a lot of people who I would say were probably towards the center or center left, who were willing to listen to critique from the far left because Donald Trump was the president, and because of really smart, really consistent, long-running programs of education. And I'm using education in a lowercase e sense, not in the you went to school education sense. There was so much value in people learning about social justice and leftism in the 2010s, understanding things like systemic racism, learning to understand things like, you know, transmisogyny, misogynoir. Like, these are things that were super important for people to understand. People encountering theory for the first time in their lives, and encountering it, or encountering for the second time, because they encountered it in undergrad, didn't understand it, and then they encountered it when, like, No Name was tweeting about it on Twitter, and, like, in a way where they understood it now. You know what I mean? Or understanding it via Tumblr post, right? All that stuff, I think, helped produce a critical space where people were able to be generous towards socio-political critique, or socio-political minded critique, cultural critique of artifacts like games and movies and TV shows, where people were willing to, like, go out on a limb and be like, you know, I don't necessarily agree with all this, but there's something really cool here. There's something really smart about this analysis. This part clicks to me, that part doesn't. It really, to me, feels like some of that generosity has dried the fuck up. And partly, my instinct is it's because it doesn't feel imperative right now because Donald Trump isn't in the office, right? I think for American audiences, Donald Trump opened a door to care about things that they normally wouldn't because they didn't feel like it was an existential threat. And with Trump there, everything felt like an existential threat, and so they were willing to hear arguments that were bigger and bolder than what they are. You know what I mean? And even that had a limit, right? We saw the limits of that with defund the police versus abolish the police versus what was D-Ray's thing? 12 things right now to do to make police a little less likely to kill us. Whatever the fuck D-Ray's
Wow, I haven't even thought about that.
Yeah, well, you know, so, but my point being, in the current moment, in the vibe shift, post-vibe shift, it does feel like people are just generally less interested in some of those questions. Readerships are less interested in some of those questions, or they have to be approached in different ways. And I think this just lines up with, you know, there's a lot of stuff that shifts when you have a different president in office and you're an American and you're in the United States. And there's a lot of stuff that shifts when you've been in a certain mode for a long time and you just want to have like a normal day. You just want to have a normal day. And there's something different that shifts when like Twitter becomes a hellscape. Not even before Elon Musk took over, the numbers just got so bad, right? I mean, it's you think about how often people complain now about Twitter of the thing of like, I made a tweet that was about like going into the garden and how lucky I am to have a wonderful partner that I get to spend the morning and have a coffee with them in the garden that we have, and then like being bombarded by people telling you how privileged you are about your garden, right? Like this is how you end up getting to people who do complain about cancel culture, is because the numbers on Twitter are such, and the way that the way that like stuff is lifted and put in front of strangers, and the culture of discourse, the kind of the discursive mode there is so policing forward that a statement like that was meant to be received by 500 people is instead seen by 500,000 people and then becomes the object of derision for the day. You get main charactered, and like you're not even Bean Dad. You know what I mean? You didn't even earn it. You were just making a kind of a normal tweet about a thing that was kind of nice.
You're like, I just like my wife, and everyone's like,
I just like my wife. You know, like what's up? And so that ends up being that makes that space kind of bad to do anything serious. Yeah. Because you're going to get a lot of bad faith actors, who maybe they're not even bad faith actors. They're actors again that I think are not trying to have the same type of conversation that I want to have, you know, with other people. Generally speaking, they want to have a much more superficial conversation, you know. And like, listen, if you're getting up in the morning and go in your garden with your spouse to like have a cup of coffee, yeah, you are definitely privileged, like 100%, 100%. But what do I get by calling that person out? You know what I mean? That person, that life is not directly imposed. Like there are so many other people that I have so much bigger You know, we had the CEO of the chair company, the Herman Miller today. Did you see that video of?
I did. Yep.
It's like, spend your time on that.
Right.
You know, spend your time on fucking J.K.
The garden
Rowling.
person is really low on the kill list. Let's be clear.
Really low, exactly. Last against the wall. You know what I mean? And so I think that's Twitter has changed in such a big way, in those ways that there's also been spill out across the games media industry. No one wants to have a conversation in that space anymore. Like not like it used to be. And I don't know that there's been a sort of shift in games media culture to such a degree that, like, you know, there was the 2000s felt different than the 2010s, and the 2020s feel different than the 2010s, but they don't feel like, it's not like, oh, and now X is the de facto king of the castle and it's just a variation of what came before. It does just feel kind of ghost townish sometimes. Think about how many people who were in games media 3 years ago before COVID are now in games marketing, are now in comms, are now in, and that's like, yo, pay your bills. Like I'm not coming at you in any way, right? But like there's a degree to which it's a bummer that so many people who were on the cusp of, or who were great reporters or good critics or great critics, the only way they can pay their bills now is to like go hawk a game for somebody else, right? And like, listen, I'm making a game. I'm going to need someone to hawk our game. You know, I'm IP director, which means I'm going to need to talk to them about how best to do it. But my dream would be for that person to be someone whose joy in their life comes from trying to help people show the best version of their projects, and not someone who is doing that because it pays the bills, but what their joy in life was criticism or reporting. You know. It's such a bummer. So I don't know, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe part of this is I'm tuned out in a different way, and if you're doing this day in and day out, you still think this is a really healthy industry, and you still think that. But I see the layoffs, and everybody I know who hasn't been laid off is afraid of being laid off. You know, and in a way that feels way more like it could hit at any moment than it did 5 years ago. So
yeah, no, that's. I think that that kind of hit a lot of like the remaining kind of questions that we had, and I think maybe just to take us home, Austin, is there anything that we haven't talked about or that we haven't asked you that you feel like, damn, these people should have fucking asked me this during our conversation?
I don't think so. I think we kind of hit as much as we could, right? I don't think so. I'm really trying. No, I don't. Why didn't you ask me why I tweet more about sports than I used to? Those are the real questions. It's nothing. I don't have anything.
Awesome. No, it's been awesome, kind of talking with you about all these topics, and like super eye opening. Ben, what were you gonna say?
I was just going to say, we've had a very deeply parasocial relationship with you for a very long time, and this kind of hit. So thank you for talking with us.
I appreciate you. You've gotten the real Austin Walker experience, which is that I start sounding very optimistic and bright because my media training hits, and by the end of a conversation, I'm like dire and existential because that's the truth of the matter.
Let's go, baby. That's where where I really wanted it to go.
Okay, here's a positive thing. One of the things I think about all the time was 4 or 5 years ago I did a talk at NYU where the same thing happened, where it's like I was trying to prep a very optimistic like ambassador for the power of what games can do type talk, and I ended up throwing it all out 2 nights before the event and rewriting a sort of games will not save us talk. And there was some great Q&A during that, and I think it was Josie Breckner, who is a musician and a game dev, who was there. And Josie was very much like, why don't we just march on video games? Like, why don't we all unionize? Why don't we all collectivize? Why don't we all, like, change the industry in a big way? And I was very much like, that's not going to happen. The way that the games industry is infiltrated by a sort of tech startup ideology, the way that like there's so little worker solidarity, the precarity which everybody has about their jobs, the way in which there aren't really enough hubs where people can organize in person, in communities where if they do lose their jobs, they can help float each other, etc. It seems like it could never happen. And then, like, by the end of me saying that year, like, Game Workers Unite had kicked off. And in the time since then, we've seen co-ops, we've seen some unionization efforts across the world inside of games. And more generally, we've seen, like, a spring of unionization efforts across industry in North America in a big way for the first time in decades. And I love more than anything when dire existential crisis Austin is fucking wrong. And I hold on to the hope that I will continue to be wrong on my worst days. And I believe that I can be proven wrong because of my materialism. So I think the world is fundamentally made by people. We fundamentally have made the conditions that we live in, which means that they're malleable. They might be very hard to change, but you can change them. that change probably has to come largely from outside of the center of power that is North America. But in a long enough time period, I do think the world can change towards better things. It is not something that I think is impossible, as much of a doomer as I can seem. I do think games media can be in a bigger, better place, and I think the road to making it a better place again is to like much bigger, fuller changes. It's not applying band-aids to games media. It's revolutionizing what the media industries look like more generally. It's changing, capitalism, which, in some ways I'm like, oh yeah, we can save your heart. All we have to do is build you a new body. But like, I don't know. Let's start building. Let's see if we can get some Frankenstein action going, because if not, your heart is going to stop. And between those two options, I'd rather start trying to build a new body. So there's my pull.
Yeah, you pulled it up at the last moment. I feel like we got a little touch, a little flavor of Andor AMCA.
Yeah, pull back. Yeah, But this is the thing: is I finished those Andor podcasts, and then a week later, I was like, "That show is shit." This is the hardest thing about being a critic: is that like you then have to sit with it for a while and be like, "Yeah, that show was all right." And, like, I'm still high on it. Like, it's still... I had to go back to other Star Wars stuff. I'm doing a podcast on Solo in 2 days. So, like, yeah, it's better than Solo. Like, no
God
doubt.
help you, brother.
But, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We really appreciate it. My dog is telling me that I haven't paid attention to her in 2 hours, and she's mad, so...
Go pay attention to your dog. Thank you so much for having me here.
And that was our conversation with Austin Walker about the state of games journalism, about what makes good criticism, and just kind of the interesting transition from games criticism and journalism to game development. Ben, how are you feeling after having this conversation with Austin?
I feel great, delighted, elated. I think like one of the things that we kind of joke about on the pod is like that we have had a parasocial relationship with Austin for a really long time. I think you and I are both people who really looked up to him and his style of criticism and his, the way that he talks about things. I've always really appreciated the way that he brings other things into the way that he talks about a piece of media or a game, or a book or a movie or a show, where suddenly he's like putting it in conversation with Marxism, or he's putting it in conversation with, whatever else. And so it adds a lot of depth when you're like listening to him talk about something. And it feels like you can often walk away from a conversation about Zelda Breath of the Wild and feel like, oh my God, did I just like learn a bunch of stuff in a way that I think like a lot of, reviews and stuff can often feel like, how does this game function? How does it feel when you shoot things? And so I think like we have, I won't say I have always like really looked up to that way. And so it was like really cool to finally, I guess, get to talk to this person that I've listened to a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to definitely say we there, because, like I kind of feel like Austin was like the person who I looked up to when it came to games criticism and like what good games journalism is. And, I don't know about you, Ben, but I just have like distinct memories of like when I first started listening to Waypoint Radio. I want to say, unless I just made this up and like it's one of those, you've made up this memory because of how it makes you feel things. I just remember like starting listening to Waypoint when we were still at Michigan State, like near the end of our time there, and having these memories of like eating lunch in Sci-Fi and by myself, like in between classes or something, and just having my headphones in and listening to whatever they were talking about that week. And I bring it up during the conversation, I think, but as an English major, you are taught all these things about intersectionality and interdisciplinary kind of thinking in relation to criticism and, analyzing texts and thinking about how different art and history, whatever affects your own writing, like, yeah, all that. But for some reason, before Waypoint, I never really had that connection with games. And that's despite being somebody who's like literally played games almost my whole life and like used to read like IGN and Kotaku and all that stuff pre Waypoint. But for whatever reason, like the way that coverage was before I found Waypoint and Austin Walker's work specifically, I just never made that connection. And I think like that's what has made Waypoint so special for me, is that it kind of showed me that all the work that I'm doing in my English and creative writing studies actually is analogous or can be applied to this other passion that I have, which is like playing video games and talking about video games and things like that. So yeah, it just kind of felt like a really long time coming, finally being able to talk to Austin, especially after just talking to Natalie. I always wanted to get a piece in Waypoint, but didn't happen. Won't happen, but maybe in another life.
Rest in peace, Waypoint.
Yeah. It was. Obviously, the big news since we've had this conversation is that Waypoint will no longer exist as of like the beginning of June, I want to say. So, shout outs to Rob Zachney and Renata Price and Patrick Klepek and Kato and Natalie, all the Waypoint people. It's just it's kind of ironic, I think, this season, because we've brought up Waypoint a number of times to be like, they're kind of like the unicorn, like they've figured out a way to make it work despite the fact that literally everywhere else is being shuttered. So it was kind of a blow to, I mean, it is a blow, but like it was another level of a blow to then like have this conversation with Austin, and then literally the next week this happened.
Yeah, because I think like, the way that I think the team had been like pretty open about their finances and like how it works, and they had talked about like, our goal is sustainability, and we we don't make a huge profit, but we make a minor profit, right? And we're like able to cover our costs. And so I think there was this idea that like, they were kind of an island that was safe. But then obviously like Vice is now, I think, about to file for bankruptcy or has already filed for bankruptcy. And so like that whole company is going under in a big way. And so everything, including, just a little shop like Waypoint, is just getting thrown overboard in the process.
Yeah. I mean, I think Patrick, I was trying to find the tweet. He said, Waypoint was profitable for a time. The company bragged about having a subscription business with steady income. The company stopped bragging when we did too well right out of the gate, and they didn't like the lack of growth. Being profitable wasn't enough. And it's just like, yeah, I feel like that's the story for so many places right now, whether it's in games media or, media and journalism in general, or even just like game development side of things. It's kind of like everybody's chasing this exponential growth. No success is ever good enough for these executives and these boards. So yeah, it just sucks.
It sucks. It feels bad. I think it's like, it's hard, again, being in not in games journalism, but journalism. I think it's just hard constantly watching people who you're like, that person is very smart and very talented and they should definitely have a job, and then they don't, and you're like, I think it becomes very clear that a lot of the metrics that in any other job or industry you should be able to point to, and that should like make you safe, where it's like, oh, you've got the accolades, or oh, you've got the work, you've got XYZ, often doesn't end up meaning anything, and like those people can also just be first out the door, same as anybody else. It's just a crazy industry, and it sucks. I think like the end of Waypoint means that, like, I don't know, like what's the space that someone in undergrad throws on a podcast about games and is now going to be like, oh wow, this works really well, this is a great way of starting to think about video games, this expands the way that I think about things, and now it allows me to put things that I'm reading in conversation with the games that I'm playing. I think, like, again, you found your way to games criticism that way. I found my way to games criticism that way. And what's the stepping stone, right? It feels like a lot of these places where it's like you can come and start to think about these things are going away. And what we're left with is like, and we've talked about this before, I think like gamer culture can be just fucking bad.
Yeah.
Where it's like game good, and if anybody says bad thing about game, I will kill them. And it's like, I don't think that's great. I don't love that. And I think that's increasingly that is going to be the dominant, interaction with video games, and that sucks.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not like there isn't, like, to be clear, it's not like there isn't good games criticism coming from other places, whether it's
totally
Kotaku or Polygon or any of them. But I will say, like, the things that Waypoint was doing, were approaching it from a much different angle that was clearly like not profit driven, because like some of this stuff is kind of like pretty in depth in terms of like what you need to have read, or like, having a theoretical background to fully understand. Like, I mean, in a lot of senses, not to derail us too much, but it's kind of like the stuff that you would see on Winnable. Like, Ben, you just had a cover story come out with them, and it's just kind of like these more, like, I'd say academic, more leaning toward the like super nerdy, like about a specific subject or theory or idea kinds of writing that a lot of like the bigger outlets publish less of. So I think, like, in that sense, yeah, I just don't know if there's going to be something similar in the space at the level that Waypoint was at, probably like ever again. I mean, or like, not anytime soon.
And I hope it doesn't sound like I'm like diminishing all of these other places that do still exist and do still good work. But I don't know that anyone can look out at the landscape and be like, this is a healthy landscape where this kind of criticism is thriving and we're doing great out here, folks.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought Austin did a good job of just kind of breaking down, like he almost gave us a little mini masterclass on like what he considers to be good criticism and what good criticism does, which is, he kind of had a point about like, if your games criticism only references games, then, you're doing your work a disservice. Like, so much of these outside forces influence, how we engage with the world and how we interact with the art that we love or don't love. That it's important to kind of weave in those extra ripples to the fold. And that's something that I definitely agree with, and I think both of us have tried to do in the various kinds of writing, essay writing, that we do. So I thought like that was a good point. And I can only hope that like people continue to try to embody that ethos in wherever, they end up after or next.
Yeah.
Was there anything else from the conversation? I mean, we covered so much in the talking with Austin, Ben, but like, is there anything else that you feel like we should kind of dive deeper into?
No, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking back. I don't know. I think shout outs to the people who are with us here after like more than 2 hours. But I can't think of anything else that we need to like highlight or put a period at the end of.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I feel like this conversation would probably be different if the news about Waypoint didn't happen, but it's like kind of hard not to just like leave it at that, of like, Waypoint and the thing that Austin helped build from the start kind of fundamentally changed the industry in a lot of senses, and we're kind of seeing a major shift happen as places like Waypoint are kind of being folded. And yeah, it just doesn't feel great. I'm curious what's going to happen next, and I hope that everybody on the team kind of finds something that they're happy with, whether that's in games media or the industry, or like getting coins somewhere else. Like, people need to eat, and we sure as hell know that the games industry ain't paying much for a lot of folks. So yeah, just hoping that they land on their feet. And I think it's kind of easy. Like, even I was thinking right when it was announced, like, oh, they can, the Waypoint team, they can like make a Patreon, like start spin off into some new thing. But on the recent Waypoint Radio, Rob was talking about that, and just like
the healthcare costs.
Yeah,
right.
It's not as simple as you think. So
I'm sorry that I don't have anything to add.
Yeah,
it's a bummer. It's a bummer note, baby. That's that.
It's fuck capitalism, go home. Follow the folks at Waypoint, follow Austin, follow Natalie. Support their work. Continue to support work in games and outside of games that is interested in diving deeper below the surface of like why these things are the way that they are, how they tick, why they affect us. And that includes, I'm going to bring it back to us. That includes what we're doing too, like support these kinds of projects. People are doing them. It's a labor of love. Like, it's not like people are making money doing most of this stuff. So, support the people you enjoy. And if you enjoyed this episode, check out some other ones. We will be here shortly on the next episode of Origin Story, interviewing some more game developers later this summer. So just look out for that, and we will catch y'all here on the next episode.
I think we need a workshop and out. Fuck capitalism, go home. That's good. I'm not saying we need to come up with one right now. I'm just saying that's the thing that we should think about for the future.
It's true. Yeah. Thanks again for checking out the show. If you would like to follow me on Twitter, it is 3D Cisco on Twitter as well as Instagram. And you can follow Ben on Twitter at sad_radio_lad. We wanted to thank Melody Hirsch, who designed all the awesome cover art and design work for the website and the podcast itself. And we wanted to thank Ryan Hopper, who does all the intro and outro music, as well as some of the interstitial stuff you hear in different episodes. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left a review on iTunes, subscribed on either iTunes or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. Reviews help just get the show in front of more people. And it only takes a couple of minutes. So yeah, if you could do that for us, it would be greatly appreciated.
You should also visit our website at www.originstory.show. It's a great place to look at all of our episodes. There are full transcripts and a link to our Discord channel where we talk with listeners about everything OS and beyond. There's a lot of posting that goes on in there. So I don't know, if you're into that, come join us. You can also email us at theoriginstorypod@gmail.com. We're always looking for feedback, whether it's ideas for games that we should play, books that we should read, guests that we should have on the show. Just hit us up with thoughts, feelings. We're always looking for feedback, even if it's that Ben has an annoying voice and you don't want to hear it anymore. That's totally fine. So write us in. You can also follow us on Twitter at @originstory_, or our Instagram at originstory.show. As always, thanks for listening.